Welcome to the Parenting with Impact podcast with your hosts Elaine Taylor-Klaus and Diane Dempster, co-creators of ImpactParents.com, an online community, award-winning blog, and service organization helping parents all over the world to raise complex kids become capable, independent adults.
Hi everyone, Elaine and Diane here, and we know that you want your complex kids to grow up to be happy and independent, and yet you're not always sure how or when to help with that.
In this podcast, we'll encourage you to collaborate with all kinds of complex kids and support them in navigating life and learning.
And we'll interview leading experts from around the world, as well as parents in our own community, talking about how training for parents actually helps these complex kids.
We'll talk about the issues we hear parents struggling with all the time and how a coach approach can support and empower your amazing young people.
We won't tell you what to do. We're going to help you figure out how. So let's move on to the next conversation. Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be a really interesting conversation because our guest today is Emily Kircher-Morris. We are thrilled to finally connect and be able to have a conversation with her. She's a mental health therapist. She specializes in working with neurodiversity kids and teens, and she's the host of the Neurodiversity Podcast. So you can see why we've been all trying to get together for a while. And she speaks our language, y'all, because when we asked her what topics she wanted to cover, her topic is using Novelty to hack your child's ADHD, which is like right in our lane. We are so excited to have this conversation. So welcome, Emily. It's great to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm excited to chat with you.
So
why don't we start with just kind of a little bit of the backstory? How did you get involved in what you do and why you do it and all this stuff?
Neurodiversity.
Yeah. Well, I think for so many of us, it's kind of a personal story somewhere along the way. And so I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was a kid, which for women my age was not that common at that time. It was kind of at the very beginning of what we were kind of learning about ADHD at the time. And along with that, obviously school was really difficult. So what I really was passionate about doing when I graduated high school was I wanted to go into education because I wanted to make things better for kids like me, because I was like, this really was not, I felt like it could be done better. And so I wanted to do it.
I used to want to be a school principal.
Yeah. Well, I never wanted to be a principal, that's for sure. But
I wanted to change the system.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to change the system too. And so I got into education. I taught in elementary school and I went back and got a master's in gifted ed. Actually, I taught in gifted ed programming for quite a while at both the elementary and middle school levels. But what I really loved doing most of all was kind of that social and emotional piece. So I went back and got a second master's in counseling and family therapy. I worked for a while as a school counselor. That was as close to being a principal as I ever got. And then I started my private practice. And so that's primarily what I do now is I'm a mental health counselor in private practice. I have 3 neurodivergent kids who are all ADHD. And, it's kind of led to a lot of different things.
So why neurodiversity in particular? Because it's one of those, it's a hot term now. It hasn't been, and you've been doing this for a while. And so you were kind of early adopters to this realm. What was it about that particular? Because you could have gone a lot of directions.
Yeah. Well, part of it was having taught in programs. It was interesting because when I got my master's in gifted education, we weren't talking a lot about the fact that even individuals who are cognitively gifted can also have other disabilities layered on top of that. And when I started my private practice, I thought I was going to specialize with gifted kids. So I'm going, okay, we're going to deal with some anxiety, some perfectionism. And ultimately, who I ended up working with were a lot of ADHDers and a lot of autistic kids. And, really the growing awareness of that has just been amazing over the last decade or so. An interesting statistic, well, 2 quick things I'll share just from a personal standpoint. I've never been assessed or diagnosed as autistic, but I notice a lot of those traits in myself. I stopped short of self-diagnosing, but I just recognize that. I think part of that is because, first of all, when I was first assessed, Asperger's wasn't even in the DSM yet. And so I was never assessed for that. And additionally, until 2013, you couldn't be diagnosed with both ADHD and autism.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And so the other interesting statistic that I will share, though, is that of individuals who are identified as autistic, they are 1.5 times more likely than the general population to also have intelligence in the superior range. And so my point in saying that is that there's a lot of neurodiversity in that world of twice exceptionality, which is that term that we use for gifted and having another disability. So that was kind of the entry point for me. And now that's broadened, much more beyond that. But I think it's just something that we're learning more about and recognizing that it's a population that has been typically underserved. So many of the struggles that neurodivergent people face are seen as moral failings. And, that's something that we really need to improve.
I love that.
Well,
There's great things. I want to highlight, because I'm going to pull this for the notes so that people can understand. You've hit on a lot of really important topics. I heard you say you were diagnosed when girls weren't diagnosed. So that was a thing. That there was a combination of potentially of ADHD and autism, which until 2013, when the new DSM came out, providers, y'all, could only diagnose one or the other. They could not diagnose both. That's a really important historical framework to understand how things have changed.
People don't realize it.
People really don't understand that. And then you're speaking to this whole world of what we now know as 2E, twice exceptional, which are kids who are both gifted and challenged. And so many of our kids in our communities, our neurodiverse kids, really do fit into that category of twice exceptional.
Well, and the fourth thing I would add, Elaine, because you did mention this, is like we were talking about the DSM, you were talking about Asperger's, Emily, and there's, Asperger's no longer technically exists in the DSM, and yet there's this group of kids primarily right now, and adults as well, that are just kind of fitting in between the cracks again, because we're having a hard time finding language and terminology to describe what exactly is going on. So that umbrella of neurodiversity that you're describing is really designed to kind of fit everybody in and talk about all the complexities of that community.
Yeah. I like the way you put that, because sometimes people will ask, if they're not kind of part of this conversation, they will say things like, well, how do you know if you're neurodivergent, or what is neurodiversity even? I'm like, well, it's like you said, it's an umbrella term that refers to a lot of different things. And I think it's fair to recognize that people get really caught up in the diagnosis.
Words.
And what we have to realize is that this is always evolving, just like that history we were just talking about. Like, who knows when they come out with the next DSM, who knows how they're going to reframe all of this. And so it's shorthand to help describe a cluster of experiences that people have, but it's like a Venn diagram. There's a lot of gray area. And the reason I like that term, neurodiversity or neurodivergence, is that we can lump a lot of things underneath that, but we're just recognizing that people need different and unique supports. And regardless of what their particular label is, if they struggle with executive functioning, if they struggle with social relationships, if they struggle with whatever that might be, we can recognize that all kind of falls in the same realm.
Well, and the thing I love about that, let's add into the mix what I would label, I don't know if you would agree, Emily, situational neurodiversity, right? It's just sort of, there are times in our lives or situations in our space where we all have struggles with executive function. And I think that's one of the things we should acknowledge on some level. Obviously, it's not the same as living with it day in, day out.
Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. So much of my work is related to education. While I am a mental health practitioner, the books that I've written are related to education. I have a new book that's going to be out in January about creating neurodiversity-affirming schools specifically, and how do we create environments. But a big part of that is about recognizing how universal design for learning is not just effective for the neurodivergent learners in your classroom.
Right.
It helps those people who have those situational experiences, who just for a short amount of time or whatever, they're dealing with something. And if we have universal design in place where there's multiple entry points and multiple ways that people can be successful, that's good for everybody. That's the whole point of universal design. And yeah, absolutely. It's not a totally unique experience that well, if you don't have this particular label, then you don't understand, whatever. It's like there's a lot of things that we can all relate to and connect with.
Absolutely. Well, and what jumps out at me, when I first wrote the Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids, and we like the term complex, right? People would say, how do you know? What is complex? How do you know? And I used to say, if you have a complex kid, you know exactly what we mean. Right. If you don't, then that you're probably fine. But if you do, you know what we mean, and we really don't have to explain it to you. And now this term neurodiversity has really become a capture for a lot of what we're talking about. So let's take this to the next level. Okay, we've kind of set the framework for neurodiversity focus in schools, relationship between ADHD, autism, twice exceptional. And what you want to talk about today, which we love, is novelty. What has novelty got to do with these complex kids?
Yeah. So when we think about the ADHD brain, we're looking at a brain that doesn't respond to rewards in the same way that other brains do. I mean, I think that's a very, very vague way of putting that they need something a little bit different, because when you look at a lot of the struggles that ADHDers experience, it has to do often with what type of response or feedback are they getting? Is that propelling them forward, or how are they reacting to that? And when we look at the neurology of it, we recognize that, for example, the dopamine system in the ADHD brain isn't wired the same way that you see it in other brains. So that's all related to reward response and reward seeking. And when we think about the struggles in academics or the struggles at home and try to figure out how to support and get that motivation, and we look at what works, novelty is kind of a key component to that, bringing in something new, making it a little bit exciting, that can kind of trigger that dopamine. It can trigger that different type of brain wiring that propels somebody forward. And that's what we're talking about when we're thinking about motivations, like that forward motion. And so I find that when I'm working with my clients, any way that we can try to pull in even just a little bit of novelty can make a big difference in helping them feel successful and making progress to whatever their goals might be.
Well, and what's coming up is, like, we know that if something's really boring or something's hard, the ADHD brain has a really difficult time kind of slugging through it. And so that idea of, I think of the word novelty as being lighter, right? It's just, how do I make this lighter? How do I make this more, my brain kind of sparks and goes, oh, wait, what about that? Oh, wait, what about that? It creates that spark of dopamine, which makes it easier to slug through some of the boring and difficult stuff.
And I think so much of, when I think of the term neurodiversity affirming, which is a term that I use frequently, I think about how do we find ways to work with our brains as opposed to working against them. And for ADHD brains, so much of the world is set up in a way that doesn't work for them. But again, talking about that universal design, a lot of times the things that do work for ADHD brains are good for a lot of people. And I like that word you use, spark, because I sometimes think about, like, oh, that shiny object over there, that little sparkle, like what, and it catches you and it's like pulls you in. And that's what we're looking for.
So I want to go back to a term you use to set the context for this, because you said when they're struggling with the type of feedback they're getting. So can you explain a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah.
Because we're going to solution. Novelty is a solution, and it's a phenomenal solution that works for a lot of kids. But what's the problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah. So, well, going back to what Diane was saying about talking about if something's really boring, a lot of times if it's something is boring or tedious, there's no feedback that is providing any information or drive to continue that particular task in many ways. There are some people who can self-regulate through a boring task and even just a little amount of feedback, like, okay, I did that item. That feels good. That item is finished. Now I can move on to the next item. Like, that works for them. But for the ADHD brain, okay, I finished that item, but you don't get that little feedback kick of, like, okay, good, I got that done. It's like, oh my gosh, now I've got to do another one.
What's the next? Hi, it's Elaine. And if you like this podcast, you'll love our coach approach. Whether you're a parent looking for support or a professional supporting families, we invite you to download a free guide with 12 key coaching tools at impactparents.com/gift. You can begin using a coach approach to help kids become more independent or improve all of your conversations at work and at home. That's impactparents.com/gift.
So I just had an analogy. Let's check me on this. Like this may be a book, but I fished when I was a kid. I don't know if you guys have ever been fishing, but I'm imagining that a more typical brain is catching a fish with a hook, a hook, and they just kind of reel it in and reel it in and reel it in. And if you've got a neurodiverse brain, that hook is not as solid. And so you have to like go back and hook again in order to reel in and keep things going and moving forward. And I don't know if that helps anybody else, but it helped me.
No, I like that. Yeah. It's like, but it's trying to, yes, it's not just going to stay the course that way. And so you have to find something that's kind of continuing that. I think another example with the feedback is let's think about social relationships for ADHDers.
Right.
So first of all, we know that a lot of ADHD individuals experience some pretty significant negative emotions related to perceived rejection. Sometimes you hear this referred to as rejection sensitivity dysphoria. I tend to think that more than anything, that this is a culmination of the negative pieces of feedback that ADHD people receive throughout their lifetime. And it's almost like a trauma response. And so then they have this bigger reaction to it. But if you are getting that negative feedback, you're going to be much more anxious about being vulnerable in those situations. So then you react according to that. Or the flip side of this is sometimes with some of those kids who are really impulsive and they really want those friends and they do things like without thinking because they're looking again for that positive feedback, but then it backfires and they do something that doesn't work. They say something that's offensive to somebody, or they, hurt someone's feelings, or or people just don't want to be around them because it's like, okay, you can't even wait your turn. And so, but it's looking for the feedback, but then it's not effectively, it's not giving them the results that they want. And so novelty is the tool that can kind of help us try to implement strategies or learn new skills in order to hijack that brain, in order to be able to, find the solutions, reach whatever goal that is.
Well, and I have a question because as you were talking, what was coming up is there's this philosophy, I don't know if it's a philosophy or a truth that a lot of times kids will behave in negative ways to get attention, like attention seeking.
It's still feedback.
It's because it's still feedback. So talk a little, that's like a third piece of this is how do you know whether it's feedback or it's attention seeking or whatever it is, right?
Yes. Yeah. So when I think about that, as far as our kiddos who have that, okay, so going back to the brain wiring piece, and we talk about like the dopamine and the reward system and all of these different pieces, an ADHD brain often I think of as understimulated. It's often, so we talk about ADHD, and we talk about the hyperactive piece. And for what it's worth, when I think about inattention, as opposed to the hyperactive and impulsive piece, I think of inattention almost as internalized hyperactivity, as opposed to, it's like, and so I can't focus all of these things. So the ADHD brain is seeking that stimulation. And if it's not getting it in a positive way, sometimes negative attention is better than no attention. Right. And I'm going to do whatever I can to reach that stimulation level. Kids don't realize that they're doing it. They're not doing it on purpose.
Yeah. But they are because they're looking for, I love that you said that because the term I always use is stimulation seeking.
Yes.
They're seeking input. And if it means picking a fight for something to get engaging, then that would be what they do.
Yeah. Well, there's this subtle difference between doing it on purpose, meaning like I'm doing it just to be a bad kid, versus my brain is seeking stimulation. And so my brain is purposefully doing something that it thinks will get me the stimulation that I need or the feedback that I need. Yeah, very different sort of on purpose.
Right. Well, I guess this may be the difference between a conscious thought and an unconscious thought. Yes. Like on purpose, like I'm going to do this thing because, versus all of a sudden I'm
We
doing this
think,
thing and I don't really know why necessarily.
which is the truth, right?
Yeah.
The first is in the framework we teach. One of the things we teach, Emily, is it naughty or neurological? And
I
so
love
what you're
that.
describing is we think it's naughty when what's really happening is very often neurological, that they're seeking input of some kind, and the way that it's showing up may not be desirable.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go back to novelty. I was thinking about you do a lot of work in the school environment. That's your background. And you've been talking about universal design. And I've been thinking about in this conversation that, our schools were designed for kids to become factory workers and talk about boring and tedious, right? So how do you bring this novelty notion to kids and universal design in the modern world where we're not training factory workers anymore? We have to train kids to think because we don't know what the world's going to be like in 20 years.
Well, that's the truth. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there are a lot of things that we can do in the school setting that are also applicable at home. So novelty can take a lot of different, I think people think about novelty in a way that like, oh, it has to be new. And that's not necessarily the only way to consider it. I mean, it can be something new. Something new can be exciting and that can get you interested in something. But novelty also just really means like a little bit different. So for example, sometimes when I'm working with clients, we might have a situation, we're brainstorming with the kids, we come up with a strategy, they're going to try the strategy's working. They're feeling successful with it. And then 3 weeks go by, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month, whatever. And they come in, they're like, it's not working anymore. I'm like, okay,
now.
yes.
Boring.
Yes. And I'm like, that's well, and the parents are always frustrated. They're like, I don't understand. Why can't they just stick with something? Why can't they just keep going with this? And I'm like, listen, you got 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever out of it. That's awesome. Let's take that same strategy and just tweak it just a little bit, make it a little bit different. So if, for example, the goal, I don't know, say there's a strategy where they're checking off things on a list to get ready in the morning. Well, maybe instead of checking the things off, they have clips that they're moving the clips, or they're putting, any
stars instead of checks.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it seems silly, but sometimes that's all it takes is just a little tweak. So that's one thing, that we can find the things that are successful and then just shift them a little bit.
Yeah. So I want to share a story because I'm a major novelty seeker, and, like big time. And what I've learned is that even if its system, as you just described, is really, really working, once I'm tired of it, I'm tired of it. And I have to shift it up. It's for those of us who are constantly rearranging the cabinets in the kitchen or whatever. It's like, yeah, I'm tired of it being there. But what I found, to your point, and this is really an example that shows what you're saying really works. I've used the same system for 15 years, which is a journal system. I don't have any scraps of paper anymore for the most part. Everything goes in my journal. But how I use it.
Just want to show mine as well.
Right? But how I used it has changed a million times in the last 15 years. So it's the same foundational structure, but sometimes it's personal on one side and business on the other. And sometimes it's lists. And sometimes it's like, there's all different ways that I use it. But that's what allows it to stay new and shift, but to still serve my needs.
Well, and me, like if you look at my journals from 15 years ago, they're going to look exactly like the ones that I have now, with different meeting titles and different clients. But it's, and because my brain likes the consistency.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Actually, one of my favorite things annually, I use a little plug for Plum Paper. It's my favorite, where I get my planners and I get to go in and because you can personalize your layout to whatever you want it to be. And it changes every year. But again, it's like one paper planner. My husband's like, why don't you use a digital planner? I'm like, doesn't work for me. I need the thing that I can carry with me, that I can see all of it at once. I can open it up, see the whole picture. But I look forward to that. Like I start doing it in October because they always have a Black Friday sale, and and then I have it for the new year.
So, and And so just so you know, she just proved to you that it's not that people with ADHD can't plan ahead. They just have to be motivated by novelty.
Right. It has to be something new and exciting. It's like, ooh, how am I going to do it this year? What cover am I going to choose? And like, you get to put your own labels on wherever your columns or whatever. And so, yeah, I love it. And it is, I get a little excited just thinking about it right now.
Well, and what I want to highlight in what you're saying, because this is, I mean, I'm thinking about all of us more typical parents who are like, okay, I'm going to come up with this great idea for how I'm going to make it novel for my kid, right? It's just sort of what you guys are describing is you get to figure out what's novel, right? It's this sort of
never know for me what's novel.
And that's the thing. It's like, as parents, we are like, okay, here's the structure we're going to use. And how often do we put the structure in for our kids? And part of what we teach is always, let's get buy-in. Let's help them figure out what structures work for them. And so I just want to put a plug in here in the middle to go, okay, guys, parents, it's not your job to figure out what the new novel structure is that you're going to use, but to partner with your kids to really kind of watch and experiment and figure out what's stimulating and re-engaging for their brains.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Can I add one more thing? Because I know we have to wrap, but I want to, because I love this topic so much, Emily, thank you for bringing it. If you have a kid who's a novelty seeker, and not all kids are highly motivated by novelty, but a lot of them are. If you have a kid who's a novelty seeker, one of the reasons you'll notice is at the beginning of a school year, they tend to be a little more jazzed by the new teachers, the new students, the new materials. Those are novelty seekers. Mm-hmm. That same kid's going to come to you in October or February and say, I'm done. Mm-hmm. I'm done with school. And so that's a great opportunity to start shifting things up, twisting systems, tweaking systems, or saying to your kid, wow, great job. You made it to February this year. Last year, you were done in December, right? Because helping them see that they love novelty is a great way to help them kind of persevere through the tough spots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I think, some of the things that you can kind of use in those types of situations, because you're exactly right. Like, I find that competition is a great way to kind of build in some novelty. I'm very cautious about competition against others. I think that can really quickly become maladaptive, but self-competition. So for example, I've now written 4 books. 3 of them are published, 1 will be published. The way that I motivate myself is that I will sit there and time myself how many words I'm writing in an hour. I have a spreadsheet. I put it in there. Just FYI, my average is 800 words per hour at my rate that I'm writing. I kind of edit a little bit as I go, but my goal is always, can I beat that 800 words, or whatever it was that last hour. But this is really the trick when we're talking about these kids. We want them to be self-regulating with this novelty. So we're helping them find the structure. You mentioned it earlier, but like getting that buy-in from them and helping kids self-evaluate what's working and what's not. And when they are able to do that on their own, that's when they're going to start having some independence, especially, as they get to high school, as they reach adulthood. ADHD brains, let's be honest, are always going to be ADHD brains. Luckily, as kids get to be adults, they have a lot more control over their environment and what type of job they enter and all of those types of things. But ultimately, finding ways to pull in that novelty that works for them is going to be really important. So we want to help give that to them. We're guiding them, but we're not imposing it on them.
I love it. And to your point again, I love your example about using competition about writing, because that would shut me down in a heartbeat. Gotta help your kid find what works for them, because just because it works for one person doesn't mean it works.
Totally.
Right. So we definitely have to wrap this up. Emily, how can people find out more about you?
They can check out the podcast. It's called the Neurodiversity Podcast. They can listen to it anywhere. We've got lots of information. You can check out the website. We've got Facebook page, all the things, but the Neurodiversity Podcast, that's the magic words, and you can find us pretty much anywhere.
And we know that you have a gift for our audience, so we'll make sure that link is where people can find it.
Yeah.
Emily, how do you want to wrap us up? What is it that we either haven't yet talked about that we want to make sure we cover, or bring back from what we've already talked about to button us up?
I think just for parents who are going through this with their kids, I just want to recognize and validate the parents who are going through this process with their kids, but also realizing and learning a lot about themselves in ways that maybe they weren't supported when they were young.
Yeah.
And I just want to, hopefully as you're helping your child, you're also helping yourself. And just kind of pointing that out and recognizing that it is hard to be an ADHD parent to ADHD kids, because there's a lot of executive functioning that goes into parenting.
Absolutely.
And the fact that those, for any of the parents though that are here and watching and listening, like, you're doing the best that you can to be motivated yourself. You're just by being here, you're seeking out some novel ideas to help motivate yourself, to help your kid, and just keep on keeping on. I just recognize that there's a lot to it and not as easy as sometimes people think.
No, absolutely not. And we'll be talking about that in this summit with Catherine Ellison. So thank you for kind of highlighting that. And to those listening, tune into Kathy's conversation specifically about parenting ADHD with ADHD. So awesome.
Love that. So Emily, as we close, do you have a favorite quote or motto you'd like to share with our listeners?
I have two that I will share. The first one is, a little weird is good. And I have a picture of my wall that says that. And that's actually kind of just a personal embrace of like recognizing that we are okay to just be ourselves. And the other one that I've heard, and I'm not quite sure of the original source, it's not my original quote, but I really love it, is some days the ADHD wins. And that just is kind of an opportunity for me to give myself some self-compassion when things don't go all well, when I double book myself, whatever it might be. And, that's okay. It's just, one step at a time.
Totally with you. Totally with you. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Me, thank you for that. So, Emily, thank you again for being here, for the work that you're doing in the world. It's lovely to watch your trajectory and to know what you're bringing from all of your experience to impact so many families. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And to those of you tuning in and listening, thank you for what you're doing for yourself and for your kids. Take a moment, ask yourself, what's your insight from this conversation? What are you taking away? We've been talking about a lot of things. We've set the stage about neurodiversity and twice exceptional and all kinds of stuff at the beginning, and moved into a conversation about novelty and stimulation seeking. What are you taking away from today that you want to bring forward with you into your week? How do you want to use this?
And as we close, always, thank you for what you're doing for yourself and for your kids. At the end of the day, you make the difference.
Take care, everybody.
You've been listening to the Parenting with Impact podcast with Elaine and Diane. For more information on the Impact Parents community or to join Sanity School for Parents, please visit impactparents.com. If you like what you've heard, please share this podcast with friends who need similar guidance and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For the essentials of Elaine and Diane's coach approach to parenting, download a free tip sheet at impactparents.com/podcast.
Behavior therapy training for parents is actually recommended as a first-line treatment for complex kids. For information about Sanity School, our training program for parents or teachers, which has helped thousands of families around the globe, visit impactparents.com/sanityschool.